The frosty air over East Prussia cut at the lungs like a razor blade. On February 14, 1945, in the sky over Königsberg, Captain Alexei Vorozhaikin gripped the controls of his Yak-3 so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Below, through ragged clouds, the frozen land of East Prussia, the Third Reich's last eastern bastion, was visible. The roar of the M105 PF engine merged with the howl of the wind at an altitude of 4,000 meters. The radio crackled with interference, but short reports from ground spotters broke through the static. The enemy was somewhere nearby. Vorozhaikin felt it in his gut, an instinct honed over 120 aerial battles. If this story interests you, like and subscribe to the channel. Many amazing facts from aviation history are yet to come. Alexei Ivanovich Vorozhaikin was born in 1912 in the village of Ryabtsevo, Tula Governorate. By February 1945, he had risen from an ordinary pilot to the squadron commander of the 728th Fighter Aviation Regiment. 46 confirmed victories made him one of the most effective Soviet aces. But numbers did not convey the main thing. The Predator's intuition that had saved his life countless times in the skies over Stalingrad, Kursk, and Belarus. On this February day, the regiment was tasked with covering Il-2 attack aircraft, which were to strike a railway station near Königsberg. The German command was transferring reinforcements to the Eastern Front through it, attempting to stem the advance of Marshal Vasilevsky's Third Belarusian Front. Every train carrying troops or ammunition that broke through this bottleneck meant additional losses for Soviet infantrymen. Vorozhaikin's Yak-3 was a special machine. Built at factory number in Novosibirsk, it rolled off the assembly line in November 1944. Light, only 2697 kilograms at takeoff weight, it could reach speeds of up to 650 kilometers per hour at an altitude of 4,100 meters. German pilots initially underestimated these small fighters with red stars on their wings. Messerschmitt Bf 109Gs seemed more imposing, their Daimler-Benz engines roaring more powerfully. But Soviet designers Yakovlev created not just an aircraft, they created a weapon honed for aerial combat. The cockpit smelled of aviation fuel and machine oil, a scent that had become familiar to Vorozhaikin over the years of war. He checked the instruments, engine temperature normal, oil pressure stable, ammunition full. The 20mm Schwack cannon and 2 UBS machine guns were ready for battle. At an altitude of 3,500 meters, to the left of his course, he distinguished the silhouettes of 8 Il-2s under the command of Major Kramarenko. The attack aircraft flew in a tight formation, their armored bodies glinting in the cold February sun. Suddenly, a calm voice from the ground spotter sounded in his headphones. Enemy detected in square 47B, altitude 5,000, course southeast. Vorozhaikin looked up and slightly to the right. At first, he saw only dots against the gray clouds. Then the dots became crosses. Messerschmitt Bf 109Gs from 2 JG-54, Grünherz, Green Heart, a squadron that had fought on the Eastern Front since the first days of the war. The German pilots moved to intercept the attack aircraft with a classic maneuver, from above and out of the sun. The group leader, Oberleutnant Heinz Mirks, was an experienced pilot with 31 victories. In his mind, the Soviet Yak-3 fighters were merely a temporary nuisance, light, underarm machines that could be swept aside with a few accurate bursts. Vorozhaikin pushed the throttle to full. The M105 PF engine responded with a steady roar, and the Yak-3 surged towards the enemy. 5 more fighters from the squadron followed him, all experienced pilots who had endured the fire of the Kursk salient and the liberation of Belarus. Lieutenant Morozov, Senior Lieutenant Kalugin, Junior Lieutenant Semenov, each knew that the lives of their comrades in the attack aircraft depended on the outcome of this battle. The altitude rapidly decreased, 4,000, 4,200, 4,500 meters. The German fighters became increasingly clear. Vorozhaikin could now distinguish individual features of the aircraft: worn paint on the fuselages, differences in camouflage, squadron emblems. The lead Bf 109G flew directly at him, as if sensing which of the Soviet pilots posed the greatest threat. At that moment, at a distance of 800 meters, Vorozhaikin performed a maneuver that no German pilot expected. Instead of a classic head-on approach, he sharply slid left and down, utilizing the Yak-3's superior maneuverability. The maneuver was risky. He could easily fall under the fire of the enemy's wingmen, but the calculation proved accurate. Heinz Merckx, firing into the empty space where the Soviet fighter had been a second ago, realized he had underestimated his opponent. The Yak-3 was now beneath his belly, in his blind spot, and rapidly gaining a position to attack. The German ace attempted to escape the attack with a sharp turn to the right, but it was too late. Vorozhaikin opened fire from a distance of 300 meters. Tracer bullets and cannon shells ripped through the left wing of the Bf-109G. The skin fluttered in shreds, and fuel poured from the punctured tanks. The Messerschmitt shuddered, lost speed, and began to fall, leaving a trail of black smoke behind it. But this was only the first skirmish. The other German pilots, seeing their leader's plane burning, were enraged. They rushed at the Soviet fighters, forgetting their primary target, the attack aircraft. The sky over East Prussia transformed into a deadly carousel of turns, dives, and climbs. In this struggle, every second decided the outcome of the battle. Every degree of turn could be the last. Lieutenant Alexei Gorovets gripped the control stick of his Yak-3, watching as German fighters formed up for battle at an altitude of 4,000 meters. The morning sun glinted off the aluminum fuselages of the Messerschmitts, turning them into silvery specks against the pale sky over the Kursk Bulge. On July 6, 1943, the air thrummed with the tension of the coming battle. The intermittent radio chatter of German pilots reached the Soviet pilots' headphones. They discussed the new Russian fighter with mockery. Too light, too simple, unworthy of the Luftwaffe ace's attention. Gorovets recognized the voice of Major Walter Novotny, one of the Third Reich's most successful fighter pilots. The MM-105PF engine hummed smoothly, without interruption. Gorovets checked his instruments. Fuel was sufficient for half an hour of intense maneuvering, ammunition full. His squadron from the 18th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment was tasked with covering Il-2 attack aircraft, heading towards German positions near Prokhorovka. Dark silhouettes appeared on the horizon, a group of 8 Bf-109G6s, led by Novotny. The German machines had an advantage in altitude and pilot experience, but Soviet pilots knew the peculiarities of their fighters better than any manual. The Yak-3 was designed for air combat at low and medium altitudes, where its maneuverability and climb rate surpassed its German counterparts. Gorovets signaled his wingman, Junior Lieutenant Petrov, and began to climb. The Soviet machines flew in pairs, using tactics honed in battles over Stalingrad. The first pair attacks the enemy's lead fighters, the second covers from the flank, the third remains in reserve for finishing off or repelling a counterattack. Novotny, with 258 aerial victories to his name, led his group into a dive on the Soviet fighters. The German pilots intended to use classic tactics, a high-speed attack from above, a short burst, and then a retreat for another pass. This scheme had brought them success against outdated I-16s and even against LA-5s. However, the Yak-3 reacted to the enemy's maneuver with unexpected speed. Gorovets sharply pulled his machine to the left, evading the lead German fighter's attack, and immediately turned to attack. The Soviet fighter seemed to dance in the air. Its lightweight and powerful engine allowed it to perform aerobatics without losing speed. The sound of the Shivak cannon ripped through the air. Gorovets opened fire on Novotny's Messerschmitt from a distance of 200 meters. The German ace tried to turn right, but the Yak-3 easily followed, closing the distance. Tracer rounds passed by the German fighter's cockpit, forcing Novotny to descend sharply. Meanwhile, Petrov attacked the second German fighter. His Yak-3 literally hung over the Bf-109, using its superior climb rate. A short burst from the cannon and 2 UBS machine guns hit the left wing of the German machine. The Messerschmitt tilted and began to fall, leaving a trail of black smoke. Novotny realized he had underestimated the enemy. The Russian fighters did not act like ordinary opponents. They used every advantage of their machines with a skill that only came with experience. The German ace ordered his group to reform into a defensive circle, a classic maneuver for protection against superior enemy forces. Gorovets saw the enemy's intentions and split his squadron. 4 Yak-3s continued the attack on the German circle from below, using the blind spot under the Messerschmitts' fuselages, while the remaining machines approached from above, cutting off escape routes. This tactic required precise coordination and flawless piloting. The roar of the engines reached maximum RPMs. The dogfight turned into a deadly dance of metal birds at an altitude of 3,000 meters above the fields of the Kursk region. For the first time, German pilots faced an opponent who surpassed them in maneuverability and matched them in piloting skill. A third Messerschmitt caught fire from hits by Junior Lieutenant Semenov's shells. The German pilot managed to bail out, his parachute opening over a sunflower field 10 kilometers from the front line. Nowotny watched as his comrades, one after another, fell under the blows of the Russian fighters, whose capabilities were radically different from anything he had encountered. Gorovets pursued a fourth Bf-109, whose pilot tried to escape into the clouds to the west. The Yak-3 caught up with the German machine at the very edge of the clouds. The Soviet pilot's burst was accurate. Shells hit the Messerschmitt's engine. The German fighter lost power and began a forced landing in territory controlled by the Red Army. The remaining 4 German fighters, including Nowotny's machine, tried to break through to their positions, but the Soviet pilots did not let them escape unpunished. The Yak-3 showed its true strength in the protracted dogfight, the ability to maintain energy and maneuverability even after a prolonged battle. The sound of an air raid siren reached them from the ground, where German and Soviet units were preparing for the tank battle near Prokhorovka. But in the sky, the outcome of the struggle was already decided. Nowotny, for the first time in his career, ordered a retreat, acknowledging the enemy's superiority. The sound of M105PF engines filled the pre-dawn silence of Reshetnikovo airfield. Captain Alexei Antipov checked the instrument panel of his Yak-3, his fingers automatically gliding over the fuel system switches. August 14, 1944, promised to be a hot day, and not just because of the summer weather over the Baltics. Senior mechanic Petrov reported the aircraft's readiness, but his words were lost in the growing roar of the propellers. Antipov nodded, pulling on his leather gloves. In his flight suit pocket lay an intelligent summary about German air movements towards the Jelgava railway junction. Smoke from morning campfires drifted low over the field airfield. 6 fighters of the 18th Guards Aviation Regiment prepared for an interception mission. Antipov glanced at young Lieutenant Morozov in the neighboring aircraft. Yesterday's flight school graduate was on his first combat sortie. Squadron Commander Major Savelyev raised his hand, signaling to start engines. The 12-cylinder engines roared to life almost simultaneously, drowning out the last shouts of the mechanics. Antipov felt the familiar vibration beneath his feet. The Yak-3 seemed to impatiently strain for the sky. The first rays of sun touched the fighter's wings as the group began its takeoff roll down the dirt strip. Antipov lifted off third, following the lead aircraft eastward. Below, pine forests and swamps, crisscrossed with trenches and dugouts of the front line, flashed by. At an altitude of 3,000 meters, the air became clearer. Antipov tuned his radio to the guidance frequency, listening to reports from VNOS posts. A group of German Ju-88 bombers was approaching the target, escorted by fighters. Preliminary data indicated 8 enemy aircraft. Major Savelyev led the group to the right, using cloud cover for a stealthy approach. Antipov checked his gun sight, ensuring the Shvak cannon and 2 synchronized BS machine guns were ready. Ammunition was full, 100 shells and 300 rounds per barrel. Through binoculars, the silhouettes of enemy aircraft were already discernible. The Ju-88s flew in a tight formation at 2,500 meters, covered from above by 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109G6s. The German fighters looked confident. Their pilots apparently did not expect to encounter serious resistance from Soviet aircraft. Antipov noticed one of the Messerschmitts slightly rocking its wings, a gesture of contempt he had seen in previous battles. German aces considered the Yak-3 easy prey, underestimating the speed and maneuverability of the Soviet fighter. This overconfidence had cost the Luftwaffe dearly in the final months of the war. The command to attack came through the headphones, clear and calm. Savelyev led his group in a head-on attack against the bombers, aiming to break their formation before the escort could intervene. Antipov increased throttle, feeling the Yak-3 obediently gain speed. The first enemy tracers streaked through the air to the right of the cockpit. The German gunner in the Ju-88's tail turret opened fire too early, misjudging the distance. Antipov turned left, bringing the target into his sights. The distance closed rapidly, 400 meters, 300, 200. The Shvak cannon spoke in short bursts. The first series missed. The second hit the bomber's right engine. Antipov saw white smoke pour from the engine, then flames erupted. The Judy began to lose altitude, breaking formation. At that moment, a Messerschmitt dived from above, its cannons already spitting fire. Antipov sharply turned left, using the Yak-3's superior horizontal maneuverability. The German fighter overshot, unable to turn onto the target. Now the initiative passed to the Soviet pilot. Antipov turned, tightening his turn radius to the limit. The Yak-3 responded to the controls like a living thing, allowing him to get on the enemy's tail. The Messerschmitt tried to escape by diving, but it was too late. A short burst from 150 meters. The shells entered the fuselage behind the pilot's cockpit. The Bf-109 shuddered, lost control, and began an uncontrolled descent. A few seconds later, the aircraft crashed into the forest, raising a column of smoke and flames. Antipov looked around, assessing the situation. 2 Jates were already falling, engulfed in flames. Lieutenant Morozov pursued a third bomber, methodically hitting its engines. The remaining German aircraft turned west, fleeing. One Messerschmitt still tried to attack, but Major Savelyev was already on its tail. Antipov watched as the experienced commander closed in on the enemy, choosing the moment for a decisive strike. The German pilot realized the hopelessness of the situation and fled towards his lines at maximum speed. The battle ended 12 minutes after it began. Savelyev's group lost only 1 fighter. Senior Lieutenant Kuznetsov's aircraft was hit at the very beginning of the attack, but the pilot managed to make it back to friendly territory and land at an emergency airfield. Antipov returned to base as wingman, carefully monitoring his instruments. Oil temperature normal, fuel pressure stable. The Yak-3 had once again proven its superiority over the vaunted Messerschmitts, dispelling the myth of the invincibility of German aces. Below, familiar landmarks floated by: the western Dvina River, the Riga-Pskov Highway, the destroyed bridge near the village of Krustpils. The front line was gradually shifting westward, leaving liberated towns and villages behind. Each such sortie brought the long-awaited victory closer. The landing was routine. Mechanic Petrov was already waiting at the parking spot, ready to service the aircraft. Antipov shut down the engine and removed his helmet, listening to the silence of the peaceful morning. Somewhere in the distance, the dull thuds of artillery could be heard, but here, at the airfield, there was relative calm. In the squadron, headquarters tent, the participants of the sortie were already gathering. Major Savelyev marked the crash sites of downed enemy aircraft on the map, preparing a report for the regiment. Lieutenant Morozov, pale but happy, recounted his first aerial victory. Antipov lit a cigarette and went outside. The sun had risen higher, promising a clear day. The mechanics were already inspecting his Yak-3, preparing it for the next sortie. The war continued, but today's battle showed German aces could no longer feel like masters of the sky over the Baltics. The whistle of bullets tore through the morning silence over Berezovka airfield. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Gorovets pressed himself against the wing of his Yak-3, feeling his hands tremble with adrenaline. German Messerschmitts appeared from behind the clouds like a flock of predatory birds, their engines roaring menacingly and mercilessly. Dust rose in columns from the explosions, mixing with the smell of aviation fuel and burnt metal. July 7, 1943, promised to be a routine patrol day. The morning fog was just beginning to dissipate over the Kursk Bulge when the radio operator reported the approach of an enemy group. Gorovets managed to spot the characteristic silhouettes. 9 Bf-109s, flying in a tight formation at low altitude. Mechanic Sergei Kuznetsov hastily disconnected the last hoses from the fuel tank. His face, covered in oil stains, reflected the same tension that gripped the entire airfield. Personnel scattered to shelters, but several technicians remained, ready to start the fighter engines at any second. Gorovets raised his head to the sky, where German aces were already beginning their dive. Their tactics were perfected to the smallest detail: a swift attack, climbing to altitude, a repeat approach. The Yak-3 stood alone among the aircraft dispersed across the field, its streamlined fuselage gleaming in the morning sun. At that moment, Gorovets heard a familiar sound, the high whistle of anti-aircraft artillery shells. Senior Sergeant Petrov's battery opened fire from the edge of the forest, trying to disrupt the enemy attack. Tracers streaked through the air in red lines, creating a deadly web around the German machines. One of the Messerschmitts broke away from the group and headed straight for the Soviet fighter parking area. The The pilot, apparently, decided to destroy the aircraft on the ground, preventing them from taking off. Gorovets watched as the enemy fighter descended, preparing for machine gun fire. Mechanic Kuznetsov shouted something unintelligible, waving his hands towards the shelters. But Gorovets was already running to the cockpit of his Yak-3. The instinct of an experienced pilot told him the only chance to save the airfield was to get airborne and engage in battle. The M105PF engine started on the first try, emitting the characteristic rumble that Soviet pilots loved so much. Gorovets quickly scanned the instruments. Oil pressure, temperature, RPM, all normal. The radiator flaps automatically opened slightly, preparing for maximum operation. The first burst of German machine gun fire missed, raising fountains of earth a few meters from the tail of the Yak-3. Gorovets added throttle, and the fighter surged forward along the dirt runway. Speed increased rapidly, a testament to the machine's lightweight and powerful engine. A second Messerschmitt was on an attack course, but it was too late. The Yak-3 lifted off the ground at a speed of only 120 kilometers per hour, demonstrating astonishing takeoff characteristics. Gorovets immediately began to gain altitude, pulling the aircraft away from ground fire. The German pilots apparently did not expect such a rapid takeoff. Their attack was designed to destroy stationary targets, but now an adversary had appeared in the air. Gorovets saw the Messerschmitt formation begin to rearrange, preparing for an aerial battle. At an altitude of 500 meters, Gorovets leveled the machine and assessed the situation. 9 against 1. The odds were not in his favor, but the Yak-3 had advantages the Germans were not yet aware of. Lightness, maneuverability, climb rate, all of this could play a decisive role in the upcoming battle. The leader of the German group, Oberleutnant Werner Müller, already had 32 enemy aircraft shot down to his credit. His Bf-109G6 was adorned with a personal emblem, a black cross on a yellow background. Müller considered himself an ace, and not without reason. Most Soviet fighters were inferior to his machine in speed and armament. But today he was to meet the newest Soviet fighter, whose existence German intelligence was only just beginning to suspect. The Yak-3 had entered service literally a month ago, and its combat capabilities remained a mystery to the enemy. Gorovets sharply put the aircraft into a right turn, avoiding a head-on attack. The Yak-3 responded to controls instantly, as if an extension of the pilot's hands. The German fighters overshot, unable to open accurate fire. Their heavy machines could not change direction of flight so quickly. Using his advantage in maneuverability, Gorovets got on the tail of one of the Messerschmitts. The distance closed rapidly. The Yak-3 accelerated faster than the enemy due to its lighter weight. The gun sight aligned with the fuselage of the enemy fighter, and Gorovets pressed the trigger. The SRVAC-20 cannon and UBS machine gun opened fire simultaneously. Tracers went straight to the target, and the German fighter shuddered from the hits. Black smoke poured from its engine, and then flames erupted. The pilot tried to guide the machine towards his lines, but the engine stalled completely. The first enemy spiraled to the ground, leaving a trail of thick smoke. Gorovets did not watch it fall. The remaining 8 Messerschmitts were already turning for an attack. Oberleutnant Müller personally led his flight in a head-on assault, counting on superior firepower. But the Yak-3 again demonstrated unexpected qualities. Gorovets sharply pulled the nose of the machine upwards, using the fighter's excellent climb rate. The German pilots remained below, their heavy machines unable to replicate such a maneuver. Having gained the advantage in altitude, Gorovets immediately attacked from above. The second Messerschmitt came under fire as it tried to pull out of a dive. The pilot apparently underestimated the speed of the Soviet fighter and did not have time to evade. Shells hit the cockpit and fuel tanks. An explosion lit up the sky with bright flames, and debris scattered in all directions. The remaining 7 German fighters tried to surround the lone Yak-3, but the Soviet machine seemed to slip out of trap after trap. Gorovets used every advantage of his aircraft: a small turning radius, rapid altitude gain, swift diving. The third enemy fell victim to a sudden attack from below. Gorovets, at low speed, crept under the belly of the Messerschmitt and unleashed a long burst at point-blank range. The German fighter disintegrated in the air from a direct hit of a 20mm shell to the fuselage. The pilot did not even have time to eject. Oberleutnant Müller began to realize that he had encountered a new type of adversary. This Soviet fighter surpassed everything he had fought before: light, fast, maneuverable, a true aerial combatant. But the German ace was not going to give up without a fight. The fourth victory came to Gorovets after a prolonged maneuvering battle. The German pilot tried to use the superiority of his Bf-109 in horizontal speed, but the Yak-3 would not let him get away. Each time the Messerschmitt tried to break off, the Soviet fighter closed the distance due to better aerodynamics. The final attack was carried out vertically. Gorovets used the excellent climb rate of the Yak-3 to get on the enemy's tail from above. The German pilot could not evade the fire and sustained fatal damage to the engine. His fighter crashed into the forest, raising a column of black smoke above the pine tops. The 5th and 6th Messerschmitts tried to attack the Yak-3 simultaneously from different directions, but the Soviet fighter slipped out of the pincer movement thanks to its amazing maneuverability. Gorovets pulled the machine into a steep climb, then rolled over on its wing, ending up on the tail of one of the adversaries. A short burst, and another Bf-109 turned into a burning torch. The 6th German fighter tried to hide in the clouds, but the Yak-3 caught up with it there too. In the dense shroud of fog, the final duel unfolded, where the more experienced and cool-headed pilot won. Oberleutnant Müller was left alone against Gorovets. The German ace understood that his chances of victory were dwindling with every minute. His heavy fighter was consuming fuel faster, and soon he would have to return to base. But first, he had to try to shoot down this damned Soviet aircraft. The last battle lasted almost 10 minutes. Two experienced pilots demonstrated supreme aerobatics, using all the capabilities of their machines. Müller tried to force a horizontal fight, where his Bf-109 had an advantage, but Gorovets invariably shifted the struggle to the vertical plane. The end came suddenly. Müller made a small error in calculating a turn, and the Yak-3 immediately appeared on his tail. Gorovets did not delay. A short, precise burst, and the 9th German fighter began to fall, leaving a trail of flames and smoke. The Oberleutnant managed to bail out of the cockpit, but landed on Soviet territory. Gorovets turned his Yak-3 towards his home airfield. Fuel was critically low, but it was enough to reach the runway. Below, Mechanic Kuznetsov was already preparing fire extinguishers and medical aid. The battle had been watched from the ground, and everyone understood the scale of the feat accomplished. On the morning of July 14, 1943, a heavy, pre-storm humidity hung over the Kursk Bulge. Captain Alexei Gorilov checked the instruments of his Yak-3 for the 3rd time in the last 10 minutes. The engine ran smoothly, but the pre-flight nervousness remained. Behind the squadron, artillery rumbled, a reminder that the German offensive was entering its decisive phase. In his headphones, the regimental commander's voice crackled, relaying the coordinates of enemy fighters detected by reconnaissance. A group of Messerschmitts was approaching the positions of the 13th Army from the northwest. Gorilov glanced at his wingmen. Lieutenants Kuznetsov and Petrov nodded in response, checking their radio communication. The static of the airwaves mingled with the monotonous hum of engines, creating the familiar symphony of war. The Yak-3 gained altitude slower than he would have liked, but Gorilov knew. His machine compensated for this with its maneuverability in combat. At the headquarters of the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, Colonel Patriotic studied reports from the front line. German aces displayed disdain for the new Soviet fighter, considering it another failure by Yakovlev's designers. Intercepted radio communications mocked Stalin's wooden toys. However, the statistics of recent weeks told a different story. Messer losses were growing. Gorilov spotted the enemy first. A flight of Bf-109Gs was at an altitude of 4,000 meters, clearly underestimating the Soviet fighters. The leading German pilot, an experienced ace by his flying style, led his group in a wide turn, preparing to attack the Il-2 ground attack aircraft that were targeting tank columns. The captain ordered his wingmen to take up an advantageous position. The Yak-3 obediently responded to the control stick movements, demonstrating the ease of handling for which pilots loved it. Gorilov remembered his instructor's words at flight school. The main thing in aerial combat is not speed, but the ability to be the first to take an advantageous position. The German flight began its dive on the Soviet ground attack aircraft. The Führungsmaschine led. Its wingmen spread out in combat formation. The pilot of the leading Messer, Oberleutnant Heinz Schmidt of JG-52, had 37 victories to his name and considered himself invincible on the Eastern Front. His diary would later contain entries about primitive Russian pilots. Gorilov led the attack from above, using the altitude advantage. The Yak-3 dived steeply, its speed increasing, but the pilot controlled every movement. The silhouette of the leading Messer appeared in the sights, a characteristic profile with a protruding radiator and angular forms. The first bursts missed. Schmidt sharply turned left, demonstrating the skill of an experienced ace. The German fighter went into a steep turn, trying to get on the Soviet pilot's tail. But the Yak-3 showed its main feature: incredible maneuverability at low speeds. A carousel of combat ensued in the air. Gorelov used every advantage of his machine, forcing the enemy to work at their limits. The Yak-3 easily entered turns that would be fatal for heavier fighters. The sound of the M105PF engine operating at full afterburner became the familiar music of battle. Schmidt felt the initiative slipping away. His Bf-109G6, superior to the Soviet fighter in speed and armament, could not keep up with the Yak-3 in horizontal maneuvering. The German ace tried to use vertical speed, but the Soviet pilot anticipated this move. Kuznetsov and Petrov, meanwhile, engaged the other Messers. Lieutenant Kuznetsov, despite his limited experience, demonstrated excellent training. His Yak-3 methodically pressed the enemy, preventing them from taking an advantageous attack position. The dogfight broke down into several individual duels. Gorelov sensed the moment. Schmidt, engrossed in the pursuit, made a mistake. His Messer hesitated for a second in a turn. The Yak-3 instantly closed the distance, and the 20mm Schwack cannon fired a short burst. The shells hit the root of the German fighter's wing. The Bf-109G shuddered from the hits. Dark smoke trailed from the damaged wing, a sign of fire in the fuel system. Schmidt tried to pull the aircraft away from the enemy, but the controls were no longer responding. Gorelov watched the German pilot struggle with the malfunctioning machine and did not deliver the final blow. One of Schmidt's wingmen, seeing his commander's demise, tried to attack Gorelov, but the Soviet ace was ready for such a development. The Yak-3 sharply slid down, evading the attack, and then instantly turned around. The German pilot did not have time to react to such a rapid change in the situation. Gorelov's second victory came a few minutes later. The inexperienced German pilot, disoriented in the fight, exposed the side of his aircraft to the fire of the Soviet fighter. The Yak-3 demonstrated another advantage: excellent firepower when applied correctly. The remaining Messers hastily left the combat area. German pilots, accustomed to easy victories over outdated I-16s and I-153s, encountered for the first time a modern Soviet fighter capable of fighting on equal terms with the best examples of the Luftwaffe. The return to the airfield passed in silence. Gorelov pondered the past battle, analyzing every episode. The Yak-3 proved itself a worthy opponent to the vaunted Messers. But, most importantly, Soviet pilots finally had a machine that matched their skill. On the ground crew greeted the returning flight with joy. There were no losses, and the enemy had suffered significant casualties. Mechanic Sergeyev inspected the captain's aircraft. Several bullet holes in the wing were a reminder of the brutality of aerial combat. The Yak-3 had passed the test. That evening, in the regimental headquarters dugout, Pokrishkin recorded the day's results. The pilot's reports were confirmed by ground observers' data. German losses were significant. For the first time in many months of the war, Soviet aviation could counter the enemy, not only with the courage of its pilots, but also with worthy equipment. The sound of the M105 engine that night became a lullaby for the tired pilots. Mechanics prepared the machines for a new day, and Gorelov reread a letter from his wife in distant Tambov. The war continued, but now Soviet pilots had real hope for victory in the air. That night, the German command received the first alarming reports about the new Soviet fighter. Arrogance gave way to caution. The Yak-3 forced the enemy to reconsider their tactics for aerial combat on the Eastern Front. The roar of the Messerschmitt's engine grew increasingly desperate. Major Karl Steiner felt his Bf-109G6 losing speed under a hail of bullets from the Soviet fighter. Plexiglass shards from the shattered canopy dug into his face, and the instrument panel flashed red with emergency system lights. Over his right shoulder, the silhouette of a Yak-3, adorned with red stars on its wings, loomed. On July 18, 1904, the sky over Courland transformed into an arena for a deadly dance of metal birds. The third day of the Soviet offensive, in the Rezekne direction, forced the Luftwaffe to commit all its reserves. JG-54, Hertz received orders to stop the advance of Il-2 ground attack aircraft, covered by new Soviet fighters, at any cost. Steiner remembered the taunts in the officers' mess at Shaoyai airfield just a week ago. Oberleutnant Müller displayed photographs of a captured Yak-3, pointing out its modest size and wooden tail construction. German pilots laughed at the Soviet plywood, contrasting it with the might of their Gustavs and their 1475 horsepower Daimler-Benz engines. Now, that plywood was methodically shooting down a flight of the second group of JG-54. Captain Ivan Kozhedub of the 180th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment executed a left turn, keeping the German fighter's tail in his sights. His Yak-3 responded to every movement of the stick with incredible precision. The VK-105PF-2 engine ran smoothly, oil temperature remained normal, and the 20mm VAC cannon still had ammunition. The aerial combat began at 1420 at an altitude of 4,000 meters. 8 Messerschmitts attacked a group of 6 Yak-3s, escorting ground attack aircraft to the Rezekne railway junction. The Germans relied on their numerical superiority and the high-altitude performance of their machines, but the Soviet pilots did not engage in high-altitude combat. Flight Commander Guards Major Alexei Alel-Yukin was the first to descend, drawing the enemy into the optimal operating zone for Soviet fighters. At altitudes up to 3,000 meters, the Yak-3 surpassed the Messers in almost all parameters: speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. Steiner tried to pull out of the dive, but the Soviet fighter clung to him like a shadow. A burst from the Yak-3's cannon and machine guns riddled the right wing of his aircraft, damaging the aileron. The Bf-109 banked sharply to the right, and Steiner felt himself losing control. Desperate voices of his comrades crackled in his helmet radio. Oberfeldwebel Kraus reported an engine fire. Lieutenant Schmidt yelled that his aircraft was being attacked by 2 Soviet fighters simultaneously. Radio chatter mingled with the howl of the wind through the punctured canopy. Kozhedub shifted his aim to the lead aircraft of the German flight. Major Steiner was an experienced pilot. The yellow stripes on his fuselage, indicating his commander status, attested to this. But the experience of battles on the Eastern Front had taught the Soviet ace-2 read the enemy's intentions from barely perceptible changes in flight. The German pilot attempted a classic maneuver, a sharp dive followed by a climb using accumulated speed. This maneuver might have worked against an I-16 or early Yak-1 modifications. But the Yak-3 possessed phenomenal climb rate. Reaching 5,000 meters took only 4.1 minutes. Kozhedub did not let the enemy escape. His fighter clung to the Messer's tail as if glued, mirroring its every maneuver. When Steiner attempted a barrel roll, the Soviet pilot anticipated the movement and opened fire with a lead. A 12.7mm UBS machine gun bullet pierced the Bf-109's fuel tank. Aviation gasoline B4 streamed down the fuselage, leaving a rainbow trail in the air. Steiner smelled the characteristic odor of fuel in the cockpit and understood. The aircraft had become a flying bomb. Below, at an altitude of 1,500 meters, another episode of the aerial battle unfolded. Junior Lieutenant Georgy Milnikov led his Yak-3 in an attack on a pair of Messers, attempting to get on the flight commander's tail. The 20-year-old pilot from Siberia had been fighting for only 4 months, but had already shot down 7 enemy aircraft. The German pilots operated according to a well-rehearsed scheme. One aircraft drew the Soviet fighter's attention, while the second approached from the side for an attack. This tactic had brought JG-54 many victories in battles against less maneuverable Soviet aircraft, but the Yak-3 allowed the pilot to control several directions at once. Milnikov sharply turned left, evading the wingman's attack, and then immediately turned right, finding himself on the lead aircraft's tail. The German pilot did not have time to react to such a rapid change in situation. A short burst from the Yak-3's cannon shattered the Bf-109G6's cockpit. Steiner watched as the aircraft of his group caught fire one after another. The experience of aerial combat over Stalingrad, Kursk, and Belarus suggested the battle was lost. Soviet fighters operated too cohesively. Their machines possessed clear advantages at low altitudes. He made a decision that came with immense difficulty. Steiner pushed the engine to emergency power and directed the burning Bf-109 towards the border with occupied Lithuania. Perhaps he could reach his territory and attempt a forced landing. Kozhedub did not pursue the damaged enemy fighter. Fuel was running low, and cannon ammunition was nearly depleted. Furthermore, the battle between Il-2 ground attack aircraft and enemy anti-aircraft artillery was still ongoing below. Covering the strike aircraft remained the primary objective. The Soviet ace looked around. Only 3 Yak-3s from his flight remained in the sky. The other comrades had either returned home with damage or Kozhedub preferred not to think about it now. The time for summing up would come later, in the dugout of the airbase by the light of a makeshift lamp. Below, the ruins of Rezekne Railway station smoldered. The ground attack aircraft of the 1st Air Army had completed their mission. A vital supply hub for Army Group North was disabled. The Soviet offensive in Courland could continue. Major Steiner reached Shalyai airfield on one engine. His Bf-109 made a hard landing, sustaining serious damage. Of the 8 aircraft from the 2nd group of JG-54, only 4 returned to base. The rest remained somewhere in the sky over Latvia. That evening, in the officers' mess of the German airfield, no one laughed at the Soviet plywood. The Yak-3 had proven its effectiveness in the most convincing way. A pre-dawn silence hung over Kurovica airfield. Wisps of fog rose from the frozen ground, and only the steady crackle of cooling engines disturbed the peace of the October morning. Captain Alexei Gromov stood by his Yak-3, scanning the distant tree line through binoculars, behind which German positions lay hidden. The fog slowly dissipated, revealing the frost-covered wings of the 18th Guards Aviation Regiment's fighters. Mechanics finished their pre-flight checks, inspecting every bolt, every detail. War had taught them not to trust to chance. In the staff tent, Lieutenant Colonel Pakrishkin bent over a map of East Prussia. Red arrows indicated the direction of Soviet troop advances, blue markers, enemy airfields. Reconnaissance reported a concentration of Messerschmitts at Insterburg base. German aces were preparing for a decisive battle. Gromov remembered the words of a captured German pilot, taken a week ago. He spoke with contempt about Soviet fighters, calling them wooden toys. He particularly mocked the Yak-3, claiming that one Bf-109 was worth 3 of their machines. These words burned in the Soviet ace's heart. The wail of a siren tore through the morning silence. Pilots rushed to their planes. Gromov jumped into the cockpit of his Yak-3 and started the M105 PF engine. The powerful roar of the engine drowned out all other sounds. The ground beneath the wheels trembled with vibration. First to take to the sky was Flight Leader Senior Lieutenant Orakov. Behind him, Gromov and Junior Lieutenant Korshunov. 3 Yak-3s formed up in combat formation and set course east. Below, snow-covered fields and villages, liberated by Soviet troops, drifted by. At an altitude of 4,000 meters, the air was thin and cold. Gromov felt the frost penetrate his fur jacket. His oxygen mask was covered in hoarfrost from his breath. He checked the gun sight, ammunition, and radio communication. Everything was working perfectly. Ahead, the outlines of German territory appeared. The reconnaissance had not been mistaken. A flight of Messerschmitts was taking off from Insterburg airfield. 4 Bf-109s gained altitude, their yellow noses gleaming in the morning sun. The Germans were coming to intercept the Soviet group. Orekov radioed a short command to engage. The Yak-3s turned into combat formation and began to close with the enemy. Gromov felt the familiar tension before a fight. His fingers tightened on the control stick, his thumb resting on the cannon trigger. The German flight came in for a head-on attack, relying on their superiority in speed and armament. The lead Messerschmitt opened fire first from long range. Tracer bullets drew fiery lines in the air, but missed their target. The Germans underestimated the maneuverability of Soviet fighters. Gromov sharply pulled the stick back and went into a steep turn to the left. The Yak-3 obediently turned, demonstrating excellent handling at low speeds. The German fighter overshot, unable to react to the maneuver. Now the Soviet ace was on the enemy's tail. A short burst from the VYA-23 cannon and UBS machine guns. Shells slammed into the Messerschmitt's fuselage, leaving ragged holes in the duralumin's skin. Steam billowed from the punctured radiator. The German plane began to lose speed and altitude. A second Bf-109 tried to get on Gromov's tail, but Korshunov warned his comrade in time. The young pilot attacked the German from above, forcing him to break off and lose his advantageous position. The coordinated actions of the flight bore fruit. The battle broke down into individual duels. Orakov pursued the lead German fighter, gradually closing the distance. The German tried to escape by diving, but the Yak-3 kept pace. In vertical maneuvers, the Soviet fighter proved a worthy opponent to the vaunted Messerschmitt. Gromov finished off the damaged enemy with a second burst. The German pilot managed to eject, and the white canopy of his parachute swayed in the morning air. One Bf-109 was shot down, but the battle continued. The remaining Germans fought with the desperation of the doomed. A third Messerschmitt came under Korshunov's fire. The young pilot acted coolly and calculatingly, not wasting ammunition. The German tried to escape into the clouds, but Korshunov anticipated the maneuver and met the enemy with a short, aimed volley. The surviving German ace found himself in a hopeless situation. 3 Yak-3s closed the encirclement, giving him no chance to escape. The one who had mocked Soviet fighters just yesterday now maneuvered desperately, trying to save his life. Orekhov delivered the decisive blow. His burst hit the Bf-109's engine, and it burst into a bright torch. The burning plane plummeted to the ground like a stone, leaving a black smoke trail behind it. The second parachute did not open. The German pilot perished in the flaming cockpit. The aerial battle lasted no more than 10 minutes, but those minutes changed much. 4 vaunted Messerschmitts were shot down without losses on the Soviet side. The myth of the invincibility of German aces dissipated, like the morning fog over the airfield. 3 Yak-3s turned back. Below, familiar fields and groves were already visible. Gromov felt tired after the battle, but with it, pride for his comrades, for his plane, for his homeland. German aces no longer laughed at the Yak-3. At Kurovitsa airfield, they were met as heroes. Mechanics surrounded the planes, inspecting the traces of battle. Bullet marks on the wings and fuselages testified to the fierce struggle. But all 3 fighters returned home safe and sound. Lieutenant Colonel Pokrishkin personally congratulated the pilots on their victory. Satisfaction was evident in his eyes. Another lesson had been taught to the arrogant enemy. The experience of this battle would become the property of the entire regiment, of all fighter aviation of the Red Army. In the evening, in the officer's dugout, Gromov wrote a letter to his wife. He spoke of his comrades, of new victories, of how the Yak-3 had proven its superiority in fair combat. Outside, an owl hooted, the same sound that had accompanied the pilot in childhood. Now it sounded like a song of victory. The earth trembled under the blows of aircraft cannons as the last Bf-109 crashed into a wheat field near Kursk. Smoke rose to the sky in columns, like black candles on the altar of war. July 12, 1943, became the day when German aces realized their time was over. The whistle of the wind through the wreckage of planes sounded like a requiem for the invincibility of the Luftwaffe. Pausing for a moment, let's look at what happened on that day when the sky changed its color. Major Alexei Fedotov lowered the landing gear of his Yak-3, feeling the machine respond to every movement of the control stick. The airfield of the 18th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment greeted him with a strip of packed earth and the smell of aviation fuel. Mechanics were already running towards the plane, their faces expressing the same thing as the pilots: tired satisfaction after a successful battle. In the cockpit next to him lay a worn photograph of his wife and daughter. Its corners had darkened from touches with gloved hands, and the faces in the picture seemed faded from the pilot's constant gaze. Fedotov carefully put the photograph into the breast pocket of his tunic, feeling his heart slow its pace after the adrenaline of the aerial combat. Sergeant Vlasov, the mechanic, ran up to the wing of the aircraft, his hands already reaching for the refueling hose. The Yak-3 consumed fuel economically, but every liter at the front was worth its weight in gold. Vlasov knew his machine like a living being. Every sound of the engine, every vibration of the airframe. He saw the pilot tiredly remove his helmet and understood. There had been downed planes again today. Fedotov jumped to the ground, feeling the firmness beneath his feet after 2 hours in the air. His uniform was soaked with sweat and smelled of leather and metal. The mechanic silently handed him a mug of hot tea from a thermos, a ritual repeated after every sortie. The tea was strong, almost black, with a hint of smoke from the field kitchen. On the regimental commander's clipboard lay intelligence reports. The Germans were transferring their best squadrons to the Kursk area. The names of Luftwaffe aces flashed in the dispatches like terrible legends. Hartmann, Roll, Nowotny. Their combat scores numbered in the dozens of downed Soviet aircraft. But times were changing, and with them, the rules of aerial warfare. The Yak-3, standing in the parking area, did not look like a formidable weapon. Streamlined forms, compact dimensions, modest protective coloring, no superfluous details, no ostentatious power. This fighter was created as a precise instrument, honed for one task, the destruction of the enemy in aerial combat. Every kilogram of weight was calculated, every detail served victory. In the evening, the pilots gathered in the dugout of the regimental headquarters. A kerosene lamp cast uneven shadows on the map of the Kursk Bulge, where red arrows marked the directions of the main attacks. The regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Kozadub, studied reports of enemy losses. In recent days, the Germans had lost more aircraft than in the entire spring. Their aces increasingly avoided combat, preferring to retreat to their territory at the appearance of Soviet fighters. Fedotov recalled the morning battle over Poniri. A quartet of Bf-109s was heading for PE-2 bombers when his flight attacked them from above. The German pilots acted according to a well-rehearsed scheme, a sharp maneuver, retreat, and attempt to get on the tail of the Soviet fighter. But the Yak-3 proved more agile. Fedotov remembered how the German ace tried to break away in a dive, but the Soviet fighter easily caught up with him and, with an accurate burst from its 20-meter cannon, tore apart the Messerschmitt's cockpit. The whistle of the wind through the radio antenna wiring recalled that morning's battle. The pilot heard the same sound when the German fighter, engulfed in flames, fell to the ground. The sound of the wind became a melody of victory for him, a reminder that the war was turning in their favor. At dawn on July 13th, the airfield awoke to the roar of engines. Yak-3s taxied onto the runway one after another, their propellers kicking up dust and dry grass. Fedotov checked the instruments. Oil pressure, normal. Coolant temperature, stable. Ammunition, full. 150 shells for the cannon and 300 rounds for the machine guns. Enough for a good fight. The takeoff proceeded normally. The Yak-3 easily lifted off the ground, gaining altitude above the morning haze of the fields. Below, ruined villages, bomb craters, and charred tank hulks drifted by. War left its scars on the earth, but the sky remained an arena where one could fight on equal terms. The radio crackled with call signs. The spotter reported a group of German fighters in the area of Hill 183. 12 Bf-109s flew in formation, their silhouettes clearly outlined against the light clouds. These were experienced pilots. Their formation spoke of high training and combat experience. Fedotov turned his fighter to meet the enemy. The Yak-3 responded instantly, its light airframe allowing maneuvers inaccessible to heavier machines. The Germans also noticed the Soviet fighters and began to regroup for an attack. The deadly carousel of aerial combat began. The first seconds decided everything. Fedotov came in from above on the lead German quartet, aiming for the Messerschmitt's center section. A burst from the cannon ripped through the air with tracer rounds, but the German ace managed to dodge. The Bf-109 sharply turned left, trying to get on the Soviet pilot's tail, but the Yak-3 was built precisely for such maneuvers. Fedotov easily turned after the enemy, closing the distance with every second. The German pilot tried to escape in a dive, a classic tactic of experienced Luftwaffe aces. However, the Soviet fighter did not fall behind, its engine running smoothly and powerfully even at maximum RPMs. The second burst hit its target precisely. 20-millimeter shells pierced the German fighter's skin, damaging the engine. The Bf-109 smoked and began to lose altitude. The pilot tried to reach his positions, but the Yak-3 gave him no chance. The third burst was the last for the German ace. Aerial combat raged around them. Soviet and German fighters intertwined in a deadly struggle, leaving white trails of tracer bullets in the sky. The Yak-3 demonstrated its superiority in horizontal maneuvering. German aces could not keep up with Soviet fighters in turns. One by one, the Messerschmitts left the battlefield. Some left with damage, others simply couldn't keep up with the pace of the battle. The Yak-3s pursued them all the way to the front line, giving the German pilots no respite. The era of Luftwaffe air superiority was coming to an end. The whistle of the wind through the antenna once again reminded Fedotov of victory. Now this sound meant not only his personal success, but also the turning point of the entire air war. German aces no longer seemed invincible. Their machines were outdated, their tactics had become predictable, and Soviet pilots had learned to fight no worse than their opponents. The return to the airfield was triumphant. Mechanics counted bullet holes in the planes. Pilots shared their impressions of the battle. 8 German fighters were claimed shot down, with the loss of only one Yak-3. The loss ratio had drastically shifted in favor of Soviet aviation. In the evening, Fedotov again took out the photograph of his wife and daughter. The faces in the picture seemed closer than in the morning. Every downed German plane brought him closer to meeting his family, closer to the end of the war. The pilot carefully put the photograph back into his pocket and stepped out of the dugout to breathe the night air. Silence hung over the airfield, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. The stars shone brightly, not obscured by the smoke of fires. Somewhere to the west, German pilots licked to their wounds after the day's defeat. Somewhere in Luftwaffe headquarters, they re-evaluated their air warfare tactics. But time was working against them. Yak-3s were arriving in combat units in ever-increasing numbers. Soviet pilots were gaining experience, and the USSR's industry was increasing its output of aviation equipment. The battle for air superiority had been lost by Germany even before the German aces realized it. The 18th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment continued its work. Every day brought new sorties, new battles, new victories. The Yak-3 proved itself a formidable weapon, capable of fighting on equal terms with the enemy's best fighters. Fedotov knew there were still many battles ahead, many trials, but now he was confident in his machine, in his comrades, in the inevitability of victory. The whistle of the wind no longer reminded him of death. Now it sang a song of liberation, bringing closer the day when the last German plane would leave the Soviet sky forever. A new day dawned over the Kursk Bulge, a day when the sky finally changed its color from black to the crimson dawn of victory. Like this story if it touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you remember most from this account of a turning point in the history of Soviet aviation.